First, the Clean Air Act. EPA is a regulatory authority, and we essentially do what Congress tells us to do. And the way that Congress tells us to control air pollution is through the Clean Air Act that covers air pollution prevention and control. And the most recent version of this was passed by Congress in 1990. And it describes both federal and state responsibilities, and it prescribes how EPA is to set standards, and it can be very, very descriptive for some of our programs in terms of literally how we calculate what the emission level is going to be in a particular source. And then it establishes a whole bunch of programs and grant programs to support states as well as to support state agencies as well as research and development. There are several distinct programs within the Clean Air Act that cover air quality, and I'm not going to run through all of them, but we've talked about two main categories of air pollution, and I think it'll help just to clarify that when we talk about criteria air pollutants, we're talking about these commonly occurring pollutants like particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide and ground level ozone, that EPA sets national ambient air quality standards based on health. And then it's the state's role to actually monitor the pollution in their state to make sure that those ambient levels in the air that we're all breathing meet the standards. And if not, develop programs to ensure that they meet the standards. And then the other main category of air pollution we talked about today was air toxics. And air toxics we treat them differently. They're also known as hazardous air pollutants. And for these pollutants, we have a lot of health information. For example, we know that certain levels of some of them can cause cancer. And Congress specified 187 of these pollutants in the Clean Air Act, and they instructed EPA to develop standards that limit the emissions at the source. So this is where we have some very explicit direction to look at technology that can reduce the emissions at the source. These are not health-based at all, they're technology-based standards. And so that's a big distinction between those two programs. And we set standards on the largest sources of these particular pollutants that are specifically identified in the Clean Air Act. Oopsie. Another separate regulatory program, and this is really where I'm going to focus the rest of my talk, is how EPA controls motor vehicle emissions and sets standards. And while both EPA and state agencies like DEQ can set standards on stationary sources or industrial sources, the Clean Air Act actually prohibits states from setting tailpipe standards on motor vehicles with very limited exceptions. EPA has the sole authority to do this. And we generally regulate engines and fuels together. So some of us can remember when regular gasoline had lead in it, and EPA had to take the lead out of the gasoline in order for us to be able to use catalytic converters or emission control equipment on cars. And we more recently, in the early 2000s, did the same thing for diesel, except it was sulfur that we took out of the diesel fuel, so we set standards on the fuel, and then that enabled us to require more advanced emission tailpipe controls on the engines. And so we've done that, and we have a very comprehensive regulatory program with standards for trucks, standards for construction equipment, farm equipment, railroads, and marine vessels. And collectively, this suite of regulations gets well over 90% reduction in emissions. However, these standards are for new vehicles, and it takes a very long time for a whole fleet of diesel-powered equipment that's out there to transition over. And so we don't expect at best, the full benefits for these rules to be achieved until the year 2030. So regulating diesel engines is important because diesel engines are a source of both those criteria, air pollutants that we talked about, as well as the air toxics. Exposure to diesel exhaust can exacerbate asthma and respiratory illness. It can worsen existing heart and lung disease, and it can result in increased numbers of emergency room visits. And in particular, it's diesel particulate matter that is particularly important for air quality and health. And I just want to talk a little bit about particulates because we were talking before about we use sort of certain language and we understand it to mean something, but that's not always clear to everybody else. So this slide, this long gray thing here, is actually a representation of a single human hair, which is 50 to 70 microns in diameter. And this down here is beach sand, just a couple of grains of it. So the particulate pollution we're talking about are these little blue dots and these red dots in particular. So just to give you a sense of how small these are, and why size matters. The smallest particles, the PM 2.5, it's that small, which means that when you inhale it, it can get very, very deep in your lung and in fact pass into your bloodstream. And somebody in one of our tabletop discussions was even saying that there's more recent information that when you inhale it, it could be a direct passageway into the brain. I haven't seen that in the scientific literature myself yet, but it's very small, and it gets into our bodies and causes some health concerns. Okay, so I'm going to transition into looking at diesel pollution through an environmental lens. Because while setting standards at the national level gets us incredible reductions across the board, it doesn't help us address disproportionately impacted communities. And it doesn't help us prioritize where investments in technology should be made. And yet we do know that there are areas in the country and in our cities, in our communities that have higher levels of concentration. And here's just an example of a couple of monitoring and modeling work that has been done. This one here, these darker red colors specifically indicate higher concentrations of diesel pollution. And this assessment was done by Oregon DEQ. And then this yellow map over here. And this is really just a visual to show you the darker colors on this. This is from a national scale modeling that EPA did, the National Air Toxics Assessment, just showing across the country that we have areas that have higher concentrations of air toxics and cumulative risk. And these generally tend to be urban areas. So this is the Seattle area here, Portland, we have Tri-Cities, Spokane, and off the map here is Boise. So we know we have these areas where we have higher concentrations, and we know that our national rules aren't really designed to address these air quality problems. So we have developed better environmental justice focused tools. And as soon as I figure out where I am in my talk, I will make right on. So once we developed the diesel rules and had this new technology, there are several public-private partnerships and collaborations to see if we could take this new technology and put it on an old engine. And so we did this, and we focused initially on school buses because school kids were riding these older buses, getting exposed. And so we tried doing these retrofit projects, and we were very successful. And as a result, the good news spread, and people talked to Congress, and Congress gave us the Diesel Emission Reduction Act in 2005, and has funded it every year since 2008. So the important point here is we didn't have the authority to do this under the Clean Air Act. It was an add-on later on that gave us the resources and the authority to issue these grants to do more of this work focused on these disproportionately impacted communities. And the way we do that is through these partnerships. And when we put out a request for projects under DERA, we specifically say our priority for this funding is to reduce emissions in disproportionately impacted areas. And furthermore, we rank these projects when they come in, and we give extra credit, if you will, to those projects that involve a community process and have community input. And these are implemented at the regional level. Like I said, I work for Region 10. We run this program through our West Coast Collaborative. And then down here off the slide shows collaboratives throughout other parts of the country that do the similar work. Tim Lynch is here. Tim, there he is in the back. And we don't have a lot of these, but Tim dropped off a few of these for me if anybody's interested. This is a paper that describes one of the projects we funded here in Oregon with the Metropolitan Contractor Improvement Project. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons. One is it's specifically designed to apply this money on non-road and construction equipment for minority-owned businesses. So it's a twofold in that we're addressing sort of a population that doesn't necessarily have businesses that are big enough to afford to buy and update their technology. So it's helping them that way. And the other thing that's nice about it is these companies tend to stay in the local areas where they are. And so we're investing that money in cleaner equipment that's going to stay right there on multiple projects in the same community. And then the really extra added benefit, I think, from a policy perspective is that there's been many discussions about when public agencies and universities are funding construction projects, that they actually require the equipment to be used to be clean diesel, to meet these higher standards. And one of the barriers to moving that kind of policy forward is that, one of the affected parties is, minority-owned contractors who can't afford to buy new equipment. So if they could be at a disadvantage in competing for one of those types of projects. But by giving them the resources, you actually make them more competitive in the scenario, and that in turn might help to advance those policies. And lastly, the last thing I want to talk about is because there's a lot of diesel pollution focused in port areas, because you have, the ships, you have the locomotives, you have the cargo handling equipment, you have a lot of trucks coming in and out. So they're areas that have a lot of pollution and therefore have a disproportionate impact on the communities that are adjacent to them. And many times those communities are in fact communities that are at an economic disadvantage or are not English speaking and are otherwise environmental justice communities. So we asked our National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for some advice on how to sort of develop a program to reduce emissions associated with goods movement. And they came back to us with 40 good recommendations on a lot of categories, including how to improve community involvement, how to address research gaps, how to engage communities in land use planning, and on and on. And so in 2013, EPA ourselves talked directly with the communities and convened stakeholders through a process much like Shalini described earlier, and ultimately put together some strategies and tools for ports that I'm going to run through really quick. One is a draft port primer for communities, a community action roadmap, and then the flip side of that is that us agency people, we often struggle with how do we effectively engage with communities. I mean, a lot of us are scientists and engineers, and we just don't know how to talk to people.
That's the first step, Dan.
And so that's, we heard from ports directly that, they need some tips and tricks for more effectively engaging. So, real quickly, these tools are first and foremost Port Primer for Communities. This is an interactive tool, and it's basically designed to help communities participate more effectively in engaging ports in decision making by increasing understanding of the role that ports play, both locally and in larger economic scenarios, how they can impact, how ports can impact local land use, and in providing examples of tools and resources that have been used successfully in other areas. And this is just a screenshot to show how this works without launching the tool. There's a lot of these buttons, and so for example, if you push one of these pollutants from diesel engines, it brings up more information specific to that. So there's a lot of information in here, but it's designed in hopefully a very user-friendly way that lets people go directly to what they want to know and not have to read through a whole bunch of stuff to try to find it. The intent is that it's easy enough to open it up and you can just pop your way through and hit those things that you need to know most about. And Don's getting ready to kick me out of here. So let me quickly say that the companion piece to this is the Community Action Roadmap. And this, I hope, is something that's more broadly applicable in helping communities sort of organize and engage. It's built upon some very basic principles around organizing and engaging, prioritizing, identifying levers for change, building relationships, developing an action plan, making a case, building momentum for change. So they're pretty basic building blocks. It's put together in this context of engaging reports, but again, it should be more widely usable. And then finally, this last part of that toolbox is the piece that is directed at the port authorities and providing to them some more effective strategies to consider in engaging with communities. And the good news is we threw these out there, we're asking people for input, and we have a specific email account, talkaboutports@epa.gov. We're also doing 3 demonstration projects across the country, one being just north of us at the Port of Seattle, where we have community groups, so Just Health Action, that is a community group up in the Seattle area that is engaging with us in the Port of Seattle to demonstrate and see how these tools are working together. And that's it. And I can skip over that one.
That's it. That's right.